Good morning. I want to thank you for making it through the weather, and I'm sure we'll have others that are trickling in. And I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank Leslie Maitland for helping to put together such a stellar scholar series, and we're so delighted that David Harris is here with us this morning. I want to share two quick stories. One I learned this morning from Kantor Manovich that in 1976, when he left the Soviet Union and came to Rome, being resettled in the whole process that eventually, to our great luck, ended up having him go to HUC and come to us in Washington. He said one of the first people he met in Rome working with those immigrants was David Harris in 1976. So he's been at this for a long time doing the right thing. I don't want to get into the particulars, but over a month ago I was called from a number of world leaders, and I had a great privilege, and I was asked a difficult question. I was asked who I thought would be the best representative for world Jewry. And I sat back and thought, and it really made me think in a different way. Because we didn't have an Eisendrath, we didn't have certain leaders, I didn't feel confident in political leaders, and I wasn't sure if I felt confident in movement leaders. And as I sat, and my first inclination, I suggested David Harris. Because for longer than anybody, David's organization, and I believe that means that David Harris has had a vision and understanding that Judaism and world Judaism is what we need to pay attention to. We need to stop being myopic and looking just at what happens in our neighborhood. And so I made a suggestion. The second suggestion that I made, thinking about that and understanding some of the situations, was also somebody from the AJC, which was David Rosen. And then I went to David Saperstein, and I went through a whole list of individuals. All Davids. The reality is that I'm not the only one who thinks in this manner. I had a conversation was privileged to be invited by the AJC to be on the phone with the director from Europe and David for a phone call, and it changed the entire view that I had for my high holiday sermons and made me think twice about what the role and the relationship was between the American Jewish community and the world Jewish community. David Harris has led AJC since 1990. And over the years, David was described by the late Israel President Shimon Peres as the foreign minister of the Jewish people. He has been deeply involved in some of the most important challenges facing the Jewish people, often with successful outcomes. Among these, the rescue of Soviet Jewries, an Ethiopian Jewry, the repeal of the infamous UN Zionism racism resolution, the listing of Hamas and Hezbollah as terrorist groups, and the end of Japan's adherence to the Arab boycott against Israel, and the launching of the Muslim Jewish Advocacy Council. We could go on with the accolades and the things that David Harris has been involved with, but as you saw, it was very difficult to simply get David into the room. He speaks to everyone. He is the same whether he is sitting with the president of the country that he's visiting, or whether he's sitting with a group of young people talking about what their responsibilities in the world. He's an advocate for the Jewish people to do the right thing, and he wants us to be leaders in the world, doing what we do best, being Jews that are strong and proud and vibrant. It is my incredible privilege and honor to present to you David Harris.
I don't want to read the wrong speech.
I just wanted to ask I'm sorry for the leak, but David had a great idea. He said we could put AJC on it for a donation bowl. He's always thinking.
It's actually what I thought. You mean it's not? Well, good morning to everyone, and thank you for being so intrepid and coming out this morning on this rainy day, although I guess we're all told that by this evening you'll be able to have your baseball game. And I wish you success. I have to say, as a New Yorker, I'm a little detached from this, and you're going to hate me right from the start, but I was feeling a little bit last night that a Jewish baseball player hit a grand slam home run. I mean, I've got to think that even members of the Jewish community in Washington had to kind of stop for a moment and say, you know, if we had to be defeated best by a Jewish player hitting a grand slam home run, doesn't happen every day, does it? So thank you, Bruce, for having me here. This is not my first time at Washington Hebrew, nor is it my second time. I feel very much at home here in the building, in your presence, in this chapel. I go back to Rabbi Joshua Haberman, and he was the first of the congregational rabbis here that I met when I moved to Washington in 1981. And while I was young and somewhat awe-inspired by him, I was also struck by the fact that he was 1 year older than my father. They were both from Vienna. Rabbi Haberman was born in 1919. My father was born in 1920. Both went to the University of Vienna. In 1938, Rabbi Haberman was able to escape after the Anschluss and make it to the States. My father was expelled from the university a few months later. His journey took an additional 7 years before he made it to the States, and I won't burden you with the details, but I always felt very close to that mindset. And I also was very struck by something that Rabbi Haberman said that had a lifelong impact on me. And I'm paraphrasing. I wouldn't dare quote without notes. But he said that it's astonishing that American Jews are the most educated and literate people in the secular world of the United States, and the most illiterate people Jewishly. And he could not reconcile those two contradictory facts and devoted a great deal of his life, and particularly after his pulpit service here, as you know, to that adult education. And by the way, just because you mentioned the cantor, is he here? You are here. So it connects to this because, as Rabbi Lustig said, I spent several years in Rome. Rome and Vienna were the two transit points for this mass migration. And I, over the course of 3+ years, lived in both. But I owe Soviet Jews a particular debt of gratitude. Sometimes they think it's the reverse. It's not. And what I owed was my discovery of what Rabbi Haberman said before I even came to Washington. Meaning, here came Soviet Jews, and most of them were focused on survival questions. They were in the West for the very first time. They were completely disoriented. They had traumatic experiences in the last days in the Soviet Union, the last humiliations of the customs and other officials on their way out. And every once in a while, a Soviet Jew would say to me, you know, David, there's a Jewish holiday coming up. You know, what is that holiday, and what distinguishes it, or why do Jews do this and not that? And I confess that I was quite secular and pretty illiterate myself. I was an external Jew. I was a warrior for the Jewish people, but I was not a graduate of Jewish day school or Jewish camp. And I will confess I was a refugee from Hebrew school the day after my bar mitzvah. You've heard of those types before. And I was feeling pretty comfortable in my own skin until these Soviet Jews came along. And then I thought to myself, wait a second, I come from New York, where there's a synagogue on every second corner, and here are people coming from Odessa and Leningrad and Kharkov asking me Jewish questions, and I don't know the answer. So I began studying pre-Google, not so simple, in Rome, and I discovered I had been robbed. I've been robbed of my own heritage and legacy. This is probably good news for your ears, Naomi, because you spent a lot of your life focusing on Jewish literacy and Jewish pride and Jewish education. And I ended up writing a book for Soviet Jews called Yivrei Mir, Jews and the World, which was a primer on what being Jewish means. It's hundreds of pages long. It explains the holidays, explains the customs, it explains the history. I would never have written the book had it not been for Soviet Jews and their questions. And I'd probably be a great candidate at the time for Rabbi Haberman's illiteracy class. Then came Joe Weinberg, and actually Marcia Weinberg was a comrade in arms in the Soviet Jewry struggle, extremely active here, and her husband was also very active as well, so again felt very close to Marcia and to Joe, and now Bruce has been a great partner and friend to AJC here in Washington, to Alan Ronkin, my colleague, who directs AJC here in Washington. I hope if you don't know him, you will. Anyway, if you don't find him, he'll find you. And Bruce has been active in our global forums, and as you heard, in many of our activities. And I especially admire what he's doing in the interfaith realm, not just here at home, but also, especially and most importantly, in the Middle East. So that's by way of, as they say, Vorspeise, or the appetizer. You know, normally I would begin any such program, no matter how scholarly, with an attempt at humor. But today is the 27th of October. I know you had a special service Friday evening, but it would be inconceivable for me to spend any time in a Jewish setting with this audience without referencing the one-year anniversary, the yahrzeit of the Tree of Life congregation. Again, I know much was said, much has been said, of course. I simply want to share with you what we at AJC thought was the necessary response. Because what's happened in this country too often after these mass shootings, whether directed against a church or a synagogue or an elementary school in Connecticut, is this almost formulaic, ritualistic response, which I sort of refer to as thoughts and prayers. You know, so everyone issues their statement or their tweet. You know, my thoughts and prayers go out to the families of the victims, and then sometimes added on is, and the world will never again be the same. I'm not convinced by that language. I'm not convinced by the thoughts and prayers. To me, you know, it sounds good, but it's actually quite meaningless. And we'll never again be the same until a week later when we're exactly the same, because nothing changes. And by the way, I would just add, if nothing changed after Sandy Hook, then you know how stuck we are. The idea that, I mean, I still can't process that, though it's not the thrust of my conversation this morning, the idea that school children, 5, 6 years old, could be targeted and mass murdered, and a nation would carry on no differently, is frankly completely beyond my realm of understanding of what any civilized society is like. I mean, the fact that half the country concluded that the response should be that we should arm everyone, beginning with teachers, you know, as the response, and of course the other half says we should disarm everyone, just shows you how, I mean, how intractable, you know, things become if after shooting children. And we'll never again be the same. Well, we are the same in too many respects. So on the day of the shooting, I gathered several of our staff, and I said to them, whatever we say, please, no thoughts and prayers. And whatever we say, please, don't include, and we'll never again be the same. We need to do something more that's sustained and that's real and that's meaningful as a response. And to their credit, they came up with Show Up for Shabbat. As they say in today's language, the hashtag Show Up for Shabbat. And the essence of it was really powerfully simple. Invite people of goodwill, Jews and non-Jews, to show up for the following Shabbat, Friday evening, Saturday morning, and just fill the rows. Little did we know that when we launched this on the Sunday, which was October 28th, that by the end of the week, more than 250 million people around the world would have engaged with this hashtag. And little did we know that around the country, and I suspect, Bruce, right here at Washington Hebrew, certainly at our synagogue, Temple Israel in New York and many others, it was standing room only. I mean, people were saying, we thought we could never top Yom Kippur. We just topped Yom Kippur. And of course, what was particularly gratifying was not just the outpouring of Jews, many of whom had, if you will, been away from synagogues for quite some time. It was the number of non-Jews who showed up. I sat down at a seat that I was shown at Temple Israel, and next to me was a Catholic priest with a white collar, and I introduced myself, thanked him for being there, and he said, if you want to thank me, thank the 3 rows behind me, because these are all my parishioners. And that was sort of repeated, I think, in many, many places, Christians and Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs and atheists and lapsed Jews and all kinds of people. So that was successful. And then we asked ourselves, okay, but that's going to end. People are still going to check the box, so what's next? And we came up with 2 more things. One was the yard site, and I'm very pleased to tell you that literally hundreds of synagogues, they may not have been quite as full, but I was at Temple Israel Center in White Plains on Friday evening. It's a conservative synagogue. There were diplomats who came. There were Muslim leaders from Westchester County. There were state officials. By the way, today at Central Synagogue in New York, Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, has issued a proclamation today and has cited this whole effort by AJC as a day to combat anti-Semitism. And there are dozens of officials around the country who've done the same. So we're trying to sustain this and build momentum. And the second thing we did, which we launched in June at our global forum here in Washington, was what we're calling our community of conscience. And the community of conscience was, or is, a way of saying what's really under attack in the United States, yes, are Jews. Jews in Pittsburgh, Jews in Poway, by the way, not to forget for a moment, Jews on the streets of New York. Identifiable Jews on the streets of New York, and also not to forget, and it has to be said if we're going to have an honest conversation, while it was white supremacists who were behind the attacks in Pittsburgh and Poway, it is not white supremacists who are behind the attacks on the streets of New York. Not at all. And if we're going to be honest, let me add a third element to this, because I believe if we're going to deal with anti-Semitism, which I want to talk about, we need to be completely honest and swivel-headed, because otherwise what we're doing is weaponizing anti-Semitism in an effort to advance a very particular political agenda, whatever that agenda might be. Let me say that until the Halle synagogue attack on Yom Kippur in Germany, every single fatal attack against a Jewish target in Europe in the last 15 years, every single one was the work of jihadists. Every single one. Paris on multiple occasions, Toulouse against the Orthodox school, Ozar HaTorah, Brussels, the Jewish Museum, Copenhagen, the main synagogue, Burgas, the bus-carrying Israeli tourists at that seaside resort, et cetera, et cetera. And I would add, 5 days before Halle, you may have noticed, though the media gave it less attention, as the media described it, a Syrian Arab refugee was caught trying to enter the Oranienburg synagogue in Berlin, carrying a knife, shouting F Israel, Allahu Akbar, and was only stopped by alert security. So sort of to move from the community of conscience, which is our way of saying we affirm pluralism, we affirm mutual respect, we are going to stand together, Catholics, Protestants, Greek Orthodox, Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus, others of goodwill, and we're going to be a force in America that not only stands against, but stands for something central to the American idea. We're also saying that if we're going to attack anti-Semitism over the long haul, we must be swivel-headed. There are three main sources of anti-Semitism in today's world, and I'm not now speaking about the sort of more familiar social anti-Semitism, say of the British upper classes over the last century, which defined anti-Semitism as not hating Jews more than necessary. But we're really talking about three main sources. And here I need to tell you a small and somewhat painful story. And I'll preface it by referencing the Greek mythological character Cassandra. Many of you know the story of Cassandra. You know her fate. What was her fate? What was her fate? Her fate, because she spurned the romantic overtures of a Greek god, was to tell the truth and never to be believed. That's the story of Cassandra in brief. I feel that in many respects at AJC over the last 19 years, we have been the global Cassandra. We saw the reemergence of anti-Semitism in the year 2000, 2001 in Europe. We saw it for a variety of reasons, mostly because we were on the ground, we were in close touch with Jewish communities, and we could witness it in a variety of expressed ways. Number one, the growing fear of Jews, especially in France, and a sense that the French government, at least in their eyes, had begun to abandon them, sort of left them to their own. Number two, the media. If you were to dial back, and we've done some studies, and if any of you would like the pamphlets, I'll tell you how to get them through Alan. We did a study of the media, European media, in the years 2000 and 2001, which was also the year of the so-called Second Intifada. And if you saw the kind of cartoons and headlines in mainstream newspapers, not talking about peripheral stuff, mainstream newspapers, and you saw this kind of reawakening of the deicide charge, for example, but instead of Jesus on the cross, it was now the Palestinian child on the cross. If you saw the inversion of Nazi imagery by superimposing Nazi imagery on the state of Israel, that the IDF was the new Wehrmacht, that Gaza was the new Warsaw Ghetto, Shimon Peres dressed in a Gestapo uniform, you began to see various elements sort of re-emerging with a kind of license that many Europeans felt that they could express themselves more freely after sort of 55 years of what they may have felt was enforced silence after the Shoah. And this is very complicated stuff. But we saw it. And we saw how many governments, too many governments, just refused to acknowledge it. I'll give you two very personal illustrations, because my family and I were living in Geneva that entire year on what was meant to be a sabbatical. The first was at our children's elite Swiss international school in Geneva, where my youngest son was cornered and bullied and threatened by the child of a bigger child of an Arab ambassador to the UN, who said to my son Josh, I understand, Josh, that you're Jewish. I want you to know that I don't like Jews. So let's rethink this. What are you? And Josh was alone. This kid was a head taller. He was petrified. As he tells the story, at least, he says, Dad, I looked at him and said, yeah, I'm Jewish, and then turned and ran as quickly as he could. Fortunately found his middle brother, who, among other things, is an ice hockey player of many years. And our middle son, Michael, immediately found this child of the Arab ambassador, went right up into his face and said, I hear you have a problem with Jews. Tell me about it. Because in the meantime, the school refused to do anything. It simply refused to do anything. In fact, subsequently I wrote an article in the International New York Times that was published about this episode and the school's refusal to do anything. They looked the other way as European governments looked the other way. During the same year, our family was in London. It was a Sunday. We were simply strolling. We came upon a demonstration. We stood at the edge. It turned out to be an anti-Israel demonstration. And the speaker, at the moment, was telling the following to the audience of several hundred people in the center of London in the year 2001. And he said to them, what's the difference between a pizza and a Jew? And he paused for dramatic effect, and then he said, you put both of them in the oven, but at least at least the pizza doesn't make noise. And the audience kind of roared with laughter. There was not a single dissenting voice in that crowd of hundreds in the center of London until your friend, my wife, suddenly disappeared from our midst. We were standing there with our children on the edge, and the next thing I know, my wife is on the stage. She's literally on the stage, surrounded by these people who have just been laughing, and my wife is in the face of the speaker, please note, speaking in Arabic, because my wife comes from an Arab country. She's one of those forgotten refugees, as they call them. You know, the hundreds of thousands of Jews that were expelled, if not murdered, that the world wants to forget while they talk only about the Palestinian refugee problem, as if there were not more than one refugee problem. Because after all, we made the mistake of resettling those refugees rather than using them as political pawns for generation after generation. So there was my wife in his face in Arabic. He was completely bewildered. He never expected it, much less from a woman, much less from an Arabic-speaking Jew. And what a woman. Thank you, Naomi. Those were some of our experiences in the year 2000, 2001. And we began spending the next years traveling back to Europe, by the way, as friends of Europe, not as enemies of Europe, trying to explain to European leaders that there was a problem. And people asked AJC, okay, what's your business plan? Okay, other than Shrine Gewalt, can you use the word Shrine Gewalt at Washington Hebrew? I guess after Josh Haberman you can, right? Before that it might have been verboten. And the people asked us, okay, AJC, okay, you saw it, you were the first to see it, wonderful, thank you very much. What's the business plan? The business plan was very simple, and it's the same business plan today. The business plan is to make sure that every European government understands that anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem, that Jews are not expected to solve the problem of anti-Semitism in Europe, nor are we expected to break every community bank by spending all the money on security and security alone. Anti-Semitism is a European problem. And by the way, now anti-Semitism is an American problem. And if you haven't yet, please take a look at the AJC survey that was released just a few days ago that's been covered widely, including in the Washington Post. And the survey is of us. We did it very consciously, not of Americans generally, of Jews. Overall, 88% of American Jews today are very or somewhat concerned about anti-Semitism. Most believe that it's risen in the last few years, and most believe that more needs to be done. Summary. Our business plan was to convince European governments there's a problem, it's your problem, you need to be swivel-headed, don't politicize the problem, and you've got the tools if you choose to deploy them to help address the problem. What are those tools? Well, police, judiciary, intelligence, education, the bully pulpit of the leadership, the political leadership of the country that sets the tone. You've got those tools. We don't. And I have to tell you, it took a very long time. It should have been a snap kind of reaction. It took years and years and years. And to some extent, we're still fighting it because we're still witnessing the politicization of it. Just one illustration today. We helped write what's called a working definition of anti-Semitism. The purpose of writing this was to try and create a standard understanding of what anti-Semitism is that could be used, again, by law enforcement, by the judiciary, by schools, by other leaders, because otherwise everyone has their own concept of what anti-Semitism is. And we very deliberately included in that, as examples of what anti-Semitism is, the demonization and delegitimization of the State of Israel. In other words, you know, the response to this is, oh, they're trying to suppress our free speech. We're not allowed to criticize Israel? No, folks, that's not what this is about. You want to criticize Israel? Sit in the Knesset. They do a great job. Read Haaretz and other newspapers. Walk the streets of Israel. Everyone's criticizing. Everyone's criticizing Israel. And it's a healthy element of what Israel's all about. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about, as an example of what is not legitimate criticism of Israel, but is anti-Semitic criticism of Israel, is something else. Those people who take the 193 member states of the United Nations and choose to select one and only one nation on the planet and say that that nation has no right to exist. And that just happens to be the only Jewish majority nation on earth, which, by the way, not only has a documented history going back thousands of years, but was the product as well of a recommendation of the United Nations in 1947. So if one's looking for legitimacy, I would submit, we would submit, that Israel has 10 times, 100 times the legitimacy of at least half the nations on the planet, if one wants to go down that road. Yet no one questions, and I'll be provocative, no one questions the legitimacy of the United States. Where was the UN resolution that recommended the creation of, or Canada? How about Australia? How about New Zealand? Isn't it funny for those of you who travel to Latin America as we do and meet with leaders, that every leader we meet with the exception of only a few, are white Europeans? Were they the indigenous people of Latin America? Strange. And I'll be even more provocative. What's the legitimacy for at least half the Arab world? The creation of Sykes-Picot, the creation of arrogant European map makers who took envelopes and began drawing borders and creating states that served their own particular colonial or other purposes. What's their legitimacy? My wife's country is Libya. Why is Libya the Libyan Arab Republic? There are no indigenous Arabs in Libya. Arabs come from Arabia. In the 7th century, they moved. They invaded, they conquered, they occupied. It's all forgotten, conveniently so. So I have to ask, we have to ask, wait a second. If you're not criticizing Bibi because you like Gantz better, or you don't like Likud, but you like a different political party, fine. No different than any of us. But this is not what that's about. You're singling out one nation and saying one nation has no right to exist? That's anti-Semitism. But you may have heard that last winter, Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, very proudly stood before the CRIF. CRIF is the umbrella body of French Jewry, their annual dinner, and he said, France will now adopt the working definition of anti-Semitism. That was a huge step forward in our efforts. Other countries had already done so, but France was among the most important and consequential. Bulgaria already had, Austria had, Lithuania had, Germany had, but more people expected Germany to do it. But when France did it, that was the game changer. But then along comes the French Parliament, or the National Assembly as it's called, and they say, slow down. We're not ready to embrace the full definition. Why? Because we don't believe that anti-Zionism is necessarily anti-Semitism. So we're still dealing, even now, with trying to explain to leaders include parliaments, what this is all about. and what anti-Semitism is and is not. I know of no other BDS movement in the world except that one directed against the State of Israel. If there are other BDS movements, please educate me. I interestingly have not seen any attempt to launch a BDS movement against Turkey for its war crimes against the Kurds, for its denial of the Armenian genocide, for its jailing of journalists. By the way, and I'm not trying to put Israel in the same category. To the contrary, I'll defend Israel's liberal, pluralistic history while also arguing that no country is perfect. We should not argue that Israel is perfect. But why is Israel again singled out for a BDS movement? No other country. Venezuela? How many? 3-4 million refugees so far, Peter, from Venezuela? I think that, and it keeps growing. Empty shelves in what was once one of the wealthiest countries, certainly in Latin America, if not beyond. No BDS movement. I'd be very surprised if at Georgetown or GW or American or any of the other great universities in America, there were any students organizing around this principle of BDS for Venezuela or for Iran or for Syria or for Turkey or for any of the other bad actors out there. So what am I to conclude about BDS? Again, I can be against the occupation if I wish. Fine, fine. Many Israelis are against the occupation. I can be against settlement building. Fine, fine. But the idea of singling out Israel and trying to bring it to its knees, sort of creating the modern-day South Africa apartheid analogy is what's going on here, and we should not be fooled. And part of what concerns me so much here, and again, allow me to be very honest because I feel at home and I've reached a stage in life where anything less than honesty is disingenuous. I worry above all, maybe drawing a page from Rabbi Haberman, I worry that we Jews are not as sure-footed and confident about ourselves, our place in the world, the case to be made, as we ought to be. I think there are still too many Jews who I would call either AWOL Jews or uncomfortable Jews. I have absolutely no problem, on the one hand, making the case, arguing for the search for an enduring two-state agreement, and on the other hand, fighting as thoughtfully as we can against the BDS movement, because I don't believe the BDS movement wants the goal of an enduring two-state agreement, not for a single moment. I think they simply found a new tool in their toolkit to try and bring about the end of the State of Israel. And I think that all of us need to understand what's actually going on there. So whether it's the BDS movement, whether it's singling out Israel and its very right to exist, whether it's what UNESCO has done over the years, the much respected, much vaunted UNESCO, which if you see what they've done over the years, and when I say UNESCO, I want to be clear, it's member states, because the UN and the UN bodies are nothing more or less than the expression of their member states. UNESCO has sought to strip the Jewish people of our historical connection to the State of Israel, and in particular Jerusalem. If you just look at it, look at the measures that have been adopted by UNESCO in years past. It's slowed down now because the US and others have been very vocal on this issue. And where are we? Do we meet this with silence or indifference or apathy? Forgive me, where's our anger? Believe me, I know that anger is not a policy tool. At the end of the day, as angry as I can be, the moment we sit with a prime minister or president or a foreign minister, Bruce, the tone changes. It has to, because our goal is not simply to score points, it's to move the needle. But where is anger as an animating force? Where is anger when we see this unique treatment of the State of Israel, this attempt to deny Jewish history? Where is our anger when Jews here in the United States and elsewhere are once again going to have to build walls? And by the way, those walls have already been built in Latin America and in Europe. Increasingly, you'll see that you won't be able to identify the synagogue easily because the synagogue has now gone behind walls. Look at Jewish schools. Look at the impact on the psychology of little Jewish children. And I've heard this myself, because my wife's family, when they fled Libya, came to Rome and settled in Rome, most of them. Ask 5- and 6-year-old children what it means to have to go through armored personnel carriers or soldiers with submachine guns, and by the way, and their finger on the trigger. This is not the kind of casual, I'm here armed, but I don't really expect anything. This is trigger ready. Jewish children have to be protected? Is that the long-term solution to being Jews? Because if it is, then what happens next, Bruce, is that many Jews are going to once again become Marranos. We're going to become Marrano Jews. We're going to become Jewish on the inside, behind closed walls, behind closed curtains, and we're going to be increasingly reluctant to express ourselves publicly. 31% of the people in the AJC survey released this past week said they have changed their behavior in order to make themselves less Jewish publicly. Is that what America was meant to be? Is that what our post-Holocaust destiny was meant to be? So, we're going to turn to a conversation now and questions, but my plea to all of us, and it's a plea that comes from the heart and is almost an atavistic plea that, if I could, would become a primal scream. Get angry. This is not normal. Don't let this become the new norm. Another synagogue shooting, another Orthodox Jew attacked on the street of Brooklyn. Oh, gee, what a shame. Thoughts and prayers. Now let's move on. The game is tonight, or whatever's tomorrow. Something's got to change in us. And we alone can do it. But without us, there's no one to do it. With us, there's a force, and then that force becomes combined with the community of conscience that we're building. That force becomes combined with relationships that we're deepening with Muslims of goodwill and African Americans of goodwill and Latinos of goodwill and Christians of goodwill here and abroad. We can't do it alone. But if we're not motivated to start somewhere, then the future is not going to look as bright as it ought to be. So that's my plea, and with that, I'm going to sit down, Bruce, next to you. I'm still looking at the tzedakah bowl. They're still giving opportunities. I'll put it that way. So thank you all very much, and look forward to discussion.
So while we're waiting there, if you have a question, if you'll raise your hand, we'll deliver a card to you. I want to take a moment and recognize Joan Churchill and Lois Goodman here, who've sponsored this lecture in memory of their parents, the Goodman lecture, and we want to thank them. Their parents were so incredibly involved in social justice and doing the right thing that this is a very appropriate opportunity for us to do that. So we thank them. While we're waiting for these, and I think that one's on for you, I hope. I want to. I know in this, and I remember because I was on the call. I wanted you start off saying that that there are three sources of anti-Semitism, and I think you got to one in talking about the media. I'm not sure if I delineated actually the three. What were the three that you would?
Again, if somehow that got missed, the far right,
okay,
white supremacists, neo-Nazis, nationalists, ultra-nationalists, the far left, the BDS movement, the anti-Zionist movement, the delegitimizing movement, and the jihadists, those who were behind the attacks in Europe, Bruce, and elsewhere.
So I also, so the question is, what is AJC's full definition of anti-Semitism?
Well, we actually, what I can do is, for anyone who wants the actual definition that we prepared, the working definition of anti-Semitism, Alan and I can.
Laura, outside.
Oh,
Super.
okay. So the answer is it's outside. Please read it. And to date, at least 12 or 13 European countries have adopted it. The State Department has adopted it. The European Parliament has adopted it. We hope the French Parliament, after what I mentioned, will eventually adopt it. So it's gaining a lot of traction.
So I was on this phone call that was so enlightening, and as I mentioned to you before, it changed everything about what I was thinking about in my own holiday sermon. And I was amazed in the fact that AJC has been saying for the last 19 years and raising the flag and talking about what we need to do and not pay attention to all that has gone on. It's whether it's the stories that we hear when somebody wants to find a synagogue in Paris on Friday evening, follow the men with the baseball caps because people are fearful of wearing and having demonstrative clothing. So in this, one of the things that I would ask is besides getting angry, what is our real responsibility as the American Jewish community, which will now obviously turn, as your survey says, to our concerns about anti-Semitism in America. But what is our responsibility globally? Because I think this has been one of the real strengths and the difference as an organization about AJC has always been taking the temperature globally. It's dealt with the Jewish community as an organism and understanding how the yin-yang between this. We often talk about, there's so many articles that are different than the Global Forum that talk about these two concentrations, America and Israel. But at the AJC Global Forum, we hear about the implications of what America and Israel do all around the world. And I'd like you to comment a little bit about what you think our responsibility as American Jewish community towards global community of Jews.
So we take seriously the Hebrew words Kol Yisrael Anavim Zeh Lezeh. All Jews are responsible one for the other. I'm not sure, Bruce, to be honest with you, sort of looking ahead at trend lines in the American Jewish community, including among younger people, I'm not sure that sense of collective responsibility, which was so characteristic of our parents, our grandparents, I hope of ourselves, is necessarily transmitted. You know, I've heard intelligent young Jews argue that that's too particularistic. Some have even used the word racist. I mean, they say, why should I be more concerned about the Jews in Argentina than I should be about non-Jews in Argentina? And I think, to be honest with you, that while AJC has created a global architecture and possibilities for participation in advocacy for people like yourselves, and people like the Rosenblatts, Andy Marks, and others who are active, I think a lot of this also goes back to the synagogue. I can say the home, because that's obviously the starting point for any concept of what collective responsibility means or any sense of consciousness. And then I moved to the synagogue. And I'm not speaking here about Washington Hebrew, but I'll give you just one example. Cantor, back to you. Back to you. I'm stunned that very few synagogues in America teach the story of the Soviet Jewry movement. I think this is one of the most extraordinary chapters in modern Jewish history, and by the way, with a happy ending. With a happy ending. And what it revealed was the power of Jewish consciousness among some, who took on the mightiest totalitarian nation on earth, were fearless. Many paid a very heavy price. They were joined by the State of Israel, by American Jews, by people of goodwill, people like Senator Henry Jackson, Charles Vanek, and others, who all came together in this global force that eventually defeated the Soviet Union and liberated Jews. And the numbers vary, but at least 1.5 million, maybe closer to 2 million Jews have left the Soviet Union, or what was the Soviet Union, to instill enormous energy in Israel, enormous energy in the United States, by the way, to create Germany as the fastest growing Jewish community in the world in recent years. Think about that one. So what I'm saying is, Bruce, it's the home, it's the synagogue, it's an organization like the American Jewish Committee, and it's uniting sense of Kol Yisrael Aravim Zeh Lezeh. We're all responsible for one another. If we believe that, we act on it. If we don't believe on it, we better start educating.
So on this level, I want to go a little bit further because I know that AJC gets this criticism. You get this criticism. Any of us who try to do this is that I'll have the people that'll come up to me and say that AJC is way too far to the left. Then I have the other one that comes and says that AJC is way too far to the right. Then I know that
now you got it right.
Then AJC is doing the right thing. So right now, what we've seen is, and what was so powerful on this, the question that was raised on the phone call was that, and I raised this question, and I brought up in my sermon that is this an anomaly, the American Jewish experience for the last 75 years, in the fact that I brought up the fact that Jacob Rader Marcus, who mispredicted the famous American historian, was not originally a famous American historian. He was, in fact, a historian of Germany and medieval history, and mispredicted what happened, and then turned to what he thought was the promised land, America, and studying the American Jewish community. So in this, what road, and right now, I'm amazed, David, and we've talked about this, that we're so polarized in our community. And right now, what proves your theory as well is that to the American Jewish community, it seems that allegiance to party, political party, is much greater than allegiance to the Jewish community or Jewish continuity. What are the efforts that you think we can do to make some of those changes?
I'd like to be cute and say, what do you think we can do?
Well, I'll give you one of the things that I'm going to do. But
okay.
go ahead, please.
That's a big one.
It is.
I'll postpone my flight if you have the time. The game is not till 8 o'clock tonight, right?
Right.
So you have time to get home and watch, I hope. Look, you're looking at what may be an American dinosaur right here. Okay, I say it up front. I'm a nonpartisan. I know I'm in a city where 90% plus in the last election voted one way. I come from a city where it was roughly the same. I'm a nonpartisan. That's my starting point in answering your question, Bruce. Why am I a nonpartisan? Not because I don't have political views. Believe me, I do. But because my job is not to have partisan political views. My job is to stand up for and defend the Jewish people as intelligently and as thoughtfully as I and we can. And where did I learn the lesson of nonpartisanship most vividly? And the answer was 1973. Anyone want to guess why? Thank you. Bingo. Thank you very. That's not a planted answer. Okay, I'll explain. The Yom Kippur War broke out. Many of you may recall. I mean, you may have been in synagogue. I was in synagogue, and all of a sudden there was a kind of murmuring in the synagogue. No, we didn't know exactly. There were no cell phones, so people couldn't even sneak on Yom Kippur. And all of a sudden, the rabbi, was Rabbi Berkowitz at B'nai Jeshurun in New York at the time, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I have to share an announcement. Israel has just been attacked." And my first response within 24 hours, and here allow me to boast, that I actually helped Israel win the Yom Kippur War. And here's why. Because I volunteered for the IDF the next day. And they rejected me. That's why they won the war. Had they accepted me, the outcome of the war, I don't want to make this too much about myself, might have been different. I was such a klutz. But then, after I was turned down, I asked myself, what do I do? Israel was caught by surprise. Israel's being pushed back. This will be a longer war. What's the outcome of the war going to be? And then what I saw, Bruce, as you'll remember, many of you, was everything came down to a decision by one man not far from this building on the question of resupply of weaponry. Mm-hmm. That man was not a popular man among many American Jews. Richard Nixon was far from popular. In fact, in most Jewish settings that I saw, he was maligned from morning till night, and with lots of good reasons. But my lesson in advocacy, at that point in time, it was not about Richard Nixon of Watergate. It was not about Richard Nixon of Tricky Dick. It was about Richard Nixon as the holder of the Oval Office, who had the power, and he alone, to make the decision which would affect the future of the state of Israel. And then I understood in 1973 that if I was not going to go in the IDF, and if I was not going to make Aliyah, that I had to become the most effective advocate I could, which meant having relations with the powers that be. That did not mean endorsement, please understand me, but open relations, respectful relations. And when I joined AJC, it was a marriage of similar philosophies. And so I'll be provocative. Most American Jews, including, by the way, the Reform Movement, and Prime Minister Netanyahu will not forgive the URJ. He will not forgive the URJ. Would not support the decision to move the embassy to Jerusalem. We did. We did. For many people, had Barack Obama made the decision, I have very little doubt that many of the people who objected would have supported the decision. But they hated Donald Trump, or hate Donald Trump so much that it gets in the way even of decisions like this. We think he made the right decision. We think that going back to an earlier conversation, Bruce, here, the idea that Israel is the only nation on earth that is not allowed to designate its own capital, and that we play with this fiction of Tel Aviv as the capital, when the Prime Minister, the President, the Knesset, the Supreme Court, the Foreign Ministry are all sitting in Jerusalem, that in the Siddur, right there, next to this lady, go find the words Tel Aviv. I defy any of you, find the words Tel Aviv. And what really upset me, Bruce, was that so many American Jews are part of the polarization themselves, which I get on other issues, I get. But that it even clouds their judgment when it comes to core Jewish interests, that's where I think we've gone a step too far and need to pull back. You can still vote against Donald Trump. You can still believe he should be impeached if that's what you believe. But if he recognizes Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, something, by the way, that all his predecessors promised, and if he recognizes the annexation of the Golan Heights, does anyone seriously believe that we should give the Golan Heights back to Syria? Syria? I mean, it's insane. Then I think we're clouding our own judgment. And my last point, unfortunately, HAC surveys have revealed too often that American Jews care very little about Israel when it comes to voting. And I just want to tell you something. And again, I'm being deliberately provocative, and I know where I'm speaking, in Washington, D.C., to a Reformed Jewish congregation. We've got challenges now in both political parties. Mm-hmm. Make no mistake about it. There is a Kulturkampf, a culture war inside the Democratic Party. And I know for some it's anyone but Trump. And I'm a nonpartisan, so I'm not going to endorse or oppose anyone publicly. But if we're not seeing some of the trends inside the Democratic Party, and we're not seeing the anti-Semitism that was openly expressed by at least one member on the floor of the House of Representatives, then we're missing the boat because we're so blinded by our hatred of one side. So my plea is not to vote for or against Trump or for or against the Democratic candidate. Please don't misunderstand me, because this is sensitive stuff. I'm simply saying keep our eyes open, because there are dangers on the populist right wing of the Republican Party, and there are dangers emerging on the left wing, the Corbynizing wing, if you understand the reference, the Corbynizing wing of the Democratic Party. And if we're Jews, thinking as Jews, concerned about Israel, the U.S.-Israel relationship, radical Islamic terrorism, etc., we can't close one eye because it's politically convenient.
And thank you so much. And I couldn't agree more. I said that on the holidays, I clearly said that we cannot have our allegiances to political parties cannot outweigh our allegiance to the Jewish community, because what it allows to happen is the weaponization of Israel and the normalization of anti-Semitism, period. Those are the two things that are the result. Now, I have a question because it's come up on there's two. One, what do you believe is and it's a loaded question in some sense because you may not believe this, but we all cry gevalt that what has happened in these last 20 years that has accelerated the nature of anti-Semitism, and what has happened in the last 2 years or 3 years that has accelerated the presence of anti-Semitism that we see. Is there anything that you believe demonstratively that brings that about?
Yes. The question is, how honest do you want me to be?
I want you to be very honest.
Okay. I think there are several factors at work, and it would be difficult to isolate simply one and suggest that that's the be-all and end-all. But there are several factors. For one, the Elie Wiesels of the world are gone.
Absolutely.
To the extent that the Shoah was, if you will, a break, B-R-A-K-E, a break on the reemergence of vicious anti-Semitism, because the Shoah was still too fresh in people's minds and memories. And the Primo Levis and the Elie Wiesels and the less sort of heralded survivors, including both of my parents and others, they're gone. The eyewitnesses, the people who liberated Dachau and Buchenwald, they're gone. The people who saw this, who understood, at least through their encounter, whether as survivors or liberators or eyewitnesses, the righteous Gentiles, the Hasidei Umot HaOlam, they're gone. And if they're not gone, they're very close to the end of their life. So the first thing I have to ask is, were the last 75 years an aberration in Jewish history? A kind of calm after the storm and before the storm? I don't know, but one has to ask. Number two, I think coupled with what I just said, in certain places there is not just a fatigue, but a resentment to the Jewish preoccupation with the Shoah. Okay already, leave us alone. How many more generations? How many more times do we need to be reminded? And by the way, there's a fascinating discussion, no time now, in Germany in particular. When can Germany become a normal country again? When will we have done enough penance, public and otherwise, to be able to move on? Well, that's the second issue. Third issue. I'll be very, very, very brutally honest. And it's the flip side of the interfaith work that you're doing, Bruce, and that AJC is doing. Migration has changed the demography of many countries in the world, including our own. And if you speak to Jews in France and Belgium and Sweden and the Netherlands, and now increasingly in certain parts of the United States, not every Muslim who comes to the United States by definition embraces American pluralism and Jeffersonian democracy. Many do, thankfully. Many more will. I know it sounds politically incorrect, but if we kind of dodge around this one, we're fooling ourselves. I mean, if you look at what happened in France, first of all, the Aliyah, driven by a sense that there is no more future for Jews, qua Jews in France, by many, and number two, the internal migration in France. That's much less discussed. The number of Jews who have left their neighborhoods because they now feel endangered in those neighborhoods, by their neighbors. And if you don't know the name Sarah Halimi, please look up the name Sarah Halimi, because she illustrates exactly this point. She didn't move. Sarah Halimi had virtually the same Holocaust story as my mother, but she went back to France after the war. My mother did not. She had a neighbor, a Muslim, to whom she was very kind, to whom she opened the door, to whom she wanted to help the integration process, and it was he who ultimately stabbed her 11 times, burned her apartment, and meanwhile, the irony, Sarah Halimi's grandchildren had made Aliyah. They felt safer making Aliyah and serving in the IDF, and we hosted some of the grandchildren at the Global Forum. They felt safer, and there they had to come back to France to bury their Holocaust survivor grandmother, who chose to believe in the safety and security, la liberté, égalité, fraternité of France. So that's another point. The fourth point, the crisis of liberal democracy. If liberal democracy appears to have failed in many places, it fuels the extremes, including the right. And we now have in European countries, but also potentially here, we have an emboldened, stronger, populist, xenophobic right wing, and part of it is a nostalgia for certain elements of fascism. And you could be sure that there is no love of Jews. By the way, ironically, there may be a love of Israel, but that's principally because Israel is viewed as a state that fights against the Muslims, quote unquote, but no love of Jews. And the last thing, and I saved the last because it's the game changer, maybe the single most important issue of all, even more than the first four, is, I heard it, someone said it. Don't be afraid to try. Who said it? Where are you? Thank you, social media. Social media has meant that everything that I've just said, everything and more, is now at the fingertips of everyone, everywhere in the world. And the levels of filters in social media, as you know, are still weak. There are ongoing debates, very, very legitimate debates about where free speech stops, where responsible corporate policies start. But in the meantime, you want to be recruited, you want to be radicalized from the right, the left, you want to find that you're in good company, you're not alone in thinking that Jews are demonic, Jews are termites. By the way, Jews are termites. Think about that one. Mm-hmm. What was the reaction in this country? What was the reaction in this country? When Louis Farrakhan said Jews are termites? There's a kind of beginning of a normalization, Bruce, too much of this. Whether people are just tired or people are distracted or whatever it is, there's a normalization of it. That Louis Farrakhan can talk about being anti-termite. What do you do with termites? You're called the exterminator. The word extermination has a certain meaning for Jews. It's not idly chosen. And yet there are people who are elected officials who still take pictures with Farrakhan, who still find him part of the mainstream. There's a lot going on. Now I come back again, if we don't start standing up and defending ourselves proudly and strongly, who's going to do it for us?
So I have to tell you that I think, I agree 100% with your response. And I am blessed that I still have a 90-year-old mother who's a Holocaust survivor who completely reminds me every day that we need to stand up, because she says is that when they lined her relatives up and family in Auschwitz, they took the liberal ones and they took the right-wing ones and they took them all at once, and it didn't make any difference. I want to focus on something, and I want you to tell them a little bit about what AJC is doing on this, because my response and a lot of the questions here, how do we fight and combat a BDS? And on the flip side, on the social media, I just don't want to forget the comment that also remember that hashtag Show Up for Shabbat had 250 million responses. So there is the advantage. The sky is falling, but we have the same opportunity. So what I want to turn in is that, you know, the crime is that when others use the media and we sit back in silence. AJC responded in this, and 250 million people responded, which is very, very important. So on this issue, because what happens is that you know, I've been in conversations in Black-Jewish relations. I've been in conversations. I clearly understand that my experience as an American white Jew is very different than an African American experience in facing racism. My daughter, who's been involved in many things and Operation Understanding, whatever, finds on the college campus this marginalization and this lack of authority. And she told me about one conversation. Somebody said, you know, when you said forgiving Germany and normalization in that sense, saying, you know, as an African American, I can never forgive slavery. And I wanted to say, did you remind her of the story of the Exodus? If that's the case, we can never forgive slavery as well. When it becomes a competition in a sense of who's the greater victim, if you will, and we have had an educational system in America which is given up on the particularism and emphasized the universalism of Judaism, and our kids are the greatest advocate for every other cause around the world, often not for their own cause or their own protection. Tell us a little bit about what AJC is doing in Access, and I believe it's called LIFT. LIFT? And then I'd like to hear, because to me, the college campus, which had been for us as people who value education, the ivory tower of the safe place where ideas could be exchanged, is now the place in which it is unsafe, and a lot of our students feel unsafe in expressing their particularism of supporting Israel and Judaism.
Right. So first I'll give you...
I think there was a question in there.
I'll choose to believe that I heard a question.
Thank you.
First I'll give you the good news. Although I think it was William Butler Yeats who said of the Irish are comforted by the knowledge that even in moments of great happiness, tragedy lurks just around the corner.
Right.
He might have been Jewish. But if you're genetically predisposed to accept any good news, let me try, and then I'll get to the concerning news. The good news is the BDS movement is a failure. That is, if the goal of the BDS movement is what its initials stand for, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, the BDS movement is a complete and total failure. The fact that a performer here or a performer there doesn't go to Israel, notwithstanding. The goal of the BDS movement was to isolate Israel and bring it to its knees. How many of you have been to Israel in the last year? Very few. How many of you have been in the last 5 years? Well, I can tell you that no matter how you measure it, Bruce, the number of tourists, foreign direct investment, the number of world leaders, however you want to list it, the interest in and engagement with Israel is going up and going up rapidly. And here I want to add a piece of good news, and then I'll come to the campus. We at AJC actually have a kind of simple algorithm for understanding trends. We meet with leaders of about 115 countries every year, often more than once and often in more than one place. It could be their ambassadors in Washington. It could be their presidents in their capitals. It could be their leaders coming to the UN General Assembly. It could be their attendance at the AJC Global Forum. So we literally meet with hundreds of such leaders each and every year from more than 100 countries. And I can tell you without any doubt that Israel's global diplomatic standing has never been higher. That is so counterintuitive, because you're going to show me then the next vote at the UN and say, but why then is Israel so isolated in this vote at the UN? And my answer to you will be because in the multilateral settings, it would be the very last place that you'll see this change. It's the bilateral. And why is this? It's not suddenly, Bruce, because people have rethought their assessment of the Likud party, or of settlements, or the security barrier, or of threats of annexation of parts of Area C. It's none of that. None of that's changed. But one thing has changed: the startup nation. There is not a nation on this planet, with the exception of, I would say, probably no more than 15 or 20. And do the math. If I'm saying 15 or 20, how many other countries does that necessarily include that would surprise you? There is not another country on the planet, except for those 15 or 20, that doesn't want some part of Israeli know-how and technology today. And so even if they vote against Israel at the UN, even if they sometimes say harsh things, I can tell you, because we've been privy to a lot of it, not all of it, a lot of it, including in some countries which would shock you. They want Israeli know-how because they know that if they cannot produce water for their people, if they cannot create arable land, if they cannot produce enough food, if they cannot combat cybersecurity, I can keep going down the list, they're dead in the water, quite literally, or they're dead in the drought. And Israel is the quintessential 21st century knowledge-based nation. It's an extraordinary story. It's one that should be a source of pride to us. Whatever our feelings may be on security barriers or settlements, we need to be able to compartmentalize and not make a kind of an all-in-one judgment that says, I don't like settlements, therefore I don't like Israel, therefore I'm not going to get involved with Israel until such time as Israel aligns with my own Bethesda or Brookline or Brooklyn values. It doesn't work that way in real life, much as we might all wish for progress on peace. The bad news: the BDS movement is failed, but the minds of young people are being poisoned. That's the success of the BDS movement. And that's where we face an enormous challenge for the future, Bruce. I can't say that AJC has the all-encompassing response, but I will tell you, just give you one illustration of what we're doing, and maybe some of your kids are involved, or Alan, you and Laura might want to speak with some people who are interested. 5 years ago, a 10th grader at the Riverdale Country School in New York — Riverdale is one of those elite private schools in New York — came with his mom to see me and said, you guys are so focused on the college campuses and all the issues going on there that you may not realize that some of those issues have filtered down to high schools, including my own. Including, he said, a chair of the social studies department at my school who is Jewish and who refuses to include Israel on any map that he has on his wall or in any textbook. He refuses. And the school has been unwilling to do anything to support Jewish students until now. By the way, even though the school is probably well over half Jewish. And then this comes down to parents, and something I said earlier, Bruce. Are we willing to stand up and show controlled anger and passion when appropriate? And if we're not, why should our children? So this young man, Ryan Berger, said to us, you have to start a program for high school students. You have to prepare us to become Jewish ambassadors and advocates. You can't wait till college. And I heard myself, almost as an out-of-body experience, saying, we'll do it. And then he walked out, and I said to myself, what did I just say yes to? I can barely manage my own 3 children. How are we going to manage high school kids, in large numbers? Fast forward 5 years, we're in 12 cities, including Washington, D.C. We have roughly 30 students in each cohort, so that's about 350 students across the country each year. The number's growing. We received a $5 million gift in 2018 to help this program move forward, to transition them to college, to stay in touch with these students, to make sure that they always have a lifeline, a kind of 911. You're in trouble at your school, you don't know how to manage it, you're not alone. You're in college, Hillel is there, but Hillel stays out of politics in some campuses. You have a lifeline. It's not enough, but we're trying to create a cadre of people, and one of the things we're teaching them, Bruce, is not just to be proud of the case that they should make, but also how to become smart advocates. Smart advocates. It's one thing to think you're right. That doesn't get you very far. How do you move the needle? How do you build friends and coalitions on campus with other students who may not be Jewish at all? Indian Americans, Korean Americans, other students who, if they knew the facts, might stand with us. So that's a big piece of this. And lastly, I would say to your point, I think competitive victimization is awful. We have this, by the way, with Poland all the time. Who suffered more, Poland as a nation or Polish Jews? Now we have this in the United States, sometimes between Jewish and black kids on campus. Well, you had slavery, we had the Holocaust, which was worse. From my point of view, and I don't just say this tactically, because that would degrade the issue. I think that there can be enough compassion in the human heart to say, I can embrace the tragedy of slavery and understand its enduring impact, and I can embrace the tragedy of the Holocaust and embrace its enduring impact. And I can understand that while 90% of Polish Jews were murdered, that Poland was also the first victim nation of the Nazis and suffered as a nation. I can say all of those things without any internal contradiction for me. And it doesn't, to me, I don't understand why some Jews feel this kind of need for this competitive victimization that always keeps us on top. In our own minds, we're on top. In other nations' mind, they're on top. That's fine. Let's work together and not fight each other.
Thank you. The last, it leads into the last question. And just to let you know that we've worked closely with Alan Ronkin, and Alan has been he's right there, he's been a consummate professional. Alan and I had the great opportunity to travel together with the mayor of D.C. and members, prominent individuals in our community who are engaged in D.C., and Alan was the consummate professional and raised some incredible questions and showed the style of diplomacy that AJC is very famous for. And it was a really good opportunity. On that trip, I got information about LIFT. I'd known about it. Washington Hebrew launches in January a program that is called READY, which means Reform, Engaged, Articulate, Determined Youth. And the idea is that we too have felt from our college students that they are finding that even after a formative and good Jewish education and being taught all the things about social advocacy and being incredible in standing up for social justice, they find themselves bewildered in many situations that are brought about by the BDS situation, the intersectionality situation, and so we want to better prepare our children. We've talked with the leaders here of LIFT and are trying to gather sources from all, and it's great, and I think it's so important. And it's very important because AJC has been doing this with Access for years with young adults, and I had the privilege of speaking to them. I want you to talk last about AJC's work building coalitions with the Muslim, Latino, African, Armenian, and Christian communities, and addressing hate and intolerance broadly. Because you and I have talked about this, and I know that it has been something that's been on the radar screen so much.
So, first of all, to Bruce's first point, and allow me to underscore what I said earlier with respect to LIFT and the high school students, your children, your grandchildren, mine. We're putting them into very socially and politically difficult situations. We should not underestimate what we're asking of them. On a university campus, for example, for a young Jew to stand up and defend the good name of Israel can come with major costs. Mm-hmm. Social costs, isolation, bullying, intimidation. You've even seen at the University of Michigan that famous story about the young woman from New Jersey who went to her teacher to get a recommendation for her junior year abroad program, which at first he was willing to give until he realized it was for an Israeli university. And then he openly refused. He refused. It's all in writing. It's not a question of her, her version, his version. Just refused. So, or one Lyft student, Brett Soslavsky from Chicago, who also happened to go to University of Michigan, different story. And they have a freshman writing seminar apparently that he enrolled in, and the assignment for that freshman writing seminar was to make a persuasive case for something. And you had to get approval from the professor first, and Brett went and he said, I want to make the case for Israel. And the professor apparently told Brett, you can't. There is no case for Israel. Now, Brett Soslavsky, graduate of the AJC Lyft program in Chicago, politely, respectfully stood his ground and said, I beg to differ. There is a case to be made for Israel, and I'd like to make it. The professor was so impressed by his maturity, to make a long story short, he made the case and he got an A. But what I'm saying is, these are extraordinarily difficult situations for 17, 18, 19-year-old children. And my point to you, to us, if we don't model that behavior ourselves, we cannot expect our children to do it for us.
Absolutely.
Which is to say, and again, I don't mean to sound like an infomercial for AJC, but whether it's in AJC or whether it's another organization, if you and we are not going to stand up and model our own behavior, standing up for the Jewish people, standing up for the good name of Israel, standing up against anti-Semitism, standing up to build coalitions and defend pluralism and American values, who is going to do it for us, and why should our children take the risk and potentially be socially ostracized, kind of almost toxic on campus? Stay away from him. Stay away from her. Pro-Israel. Not a fun thing for 4 years when all our lives we're telling our kids college is the best time of your life. So that's the message. Building coalitions, AJC has always understood, and here, this goes back almost to our founding. So, though my kids for years thought I was there at the founding in 1906, they were mathematically challenged. The genius of AJC at the time, Bruce, and then it was revolutionary, was to understand that the best defense for the Jewish people are democratic societies that respect the rights and protect the rights of all. Now today that sounds, simple, basic, obvious. In 1906 it was not. We were socially marginalized. There were no Fortune 500 Jewish presidents. There were no Ivy League presidents. Yes, there were some wealthy Jews who founded AJC, but so what? The larger picture was still one of marginalization, and yet they understood this. And we've acted on that DNA ever since. So we're in the coalition building business. We're in the bridge building business. We're in the friend raising business. And the goal is to create allies, and the larger goal is to defend American democratic pluralism. So how do you do it? You got to go beyond words. And I think what AJC understood is, if you want to have a friend, you need to learn how to be a friend. And too often Jewish conversations with others are one-way conversations. We suffered so much, pogroms, the Black Hundreds, the Inquisition, the Shoah, we need your help. I get that, but that's not the way you build a friendship. It's not the way you build a partnership. You build a partnership based on two-way conversations, on two-way listening and speaking, not one-way. And AJC understood that, you got to listen. You want to work with Latinos, you want them to be on our side, wonderful. They're a huge and growing population. But what's on their mind? What's on their mind? They don't wake up in the morning and the first thing they think about is Pittsburgh. They wake up and the first thing they may think about is El Paso, or children who've been caged or separated from their families, or simply finding a job, or getting legalized, or the Dreamers. That's what they think about. And they have every right to think about those issues, obviously, as we have a right to think about what galvanizes us. And then the question becomes, of their issues, what are we prepared to support? What is consistent with the value system of AJC in this case, Bruce? And what might not be? And where we can be supportive, we are supportive. So you mentioned Armenians. This is a really tricky one. I'll just illustrate this as a kind of final moment because, in theory, it's all very simple. It's black and white. It's neat and clean. In reality, it's very complicated in many cases. Actually, I'll give you two examples. We have been revitalizing the Black-Jewish coalition, especially in Congress. AJC was the venue in June for the launching of the Congressional Black Jewish Caucus. And Alan, you were there last week, over 200 people, dozens of members of Congress, there to kind of give energy to this. Fantastic, wonderful, terrific. But what happens when it comes down to Black Lives Matter? And what happens when it comes down, for example, to their manifesto, which includes endorsement of BDS? Then it becomes a little trickier. Well, you want to support your African American friends as much as you can, obviously, but you also want to avoid violating your own core values and principles. But what if it's their core value and principle? How do you navigate that? And we don't have time to try and sort of go through the full case study, but simply to illustrate that these are not easy issues always, but what I've always been impressed by with AJC is this kind of skillful navigation which allows people to remain friends even if we don't always necessarily agree. The other illustration, very close to Peter Rosenblatt's heart, is Armenia and Azerbaijan, for those of you who may know about this long-standing conflict. So the Armenians, and I have to add Turkey here. This is an amazing case study as far as I'm concerned. Armenians suffered a genocide beginning in 1915 that lasted for perhaps as long as 8 years. And many believed it to be the first genocide of the 20th century. And reportedly, it's in the Holocaust Museum here, reportedly, Hitler referenced the Armenian genocide when preparing the Shoah by saying, who remembers the Armenian tragedy, whatever. So how could the Jews not support every attempt to commemorate, honor, remember the Armenian genocide? By the way, not the Armenian tragedy, not the Armenian crisis, the Armenian genocide, because that's the deal-breaking word, the G word. Fine, easy, right? Not so easy. Why? Because who opposes it most staunchly? Turkey. Well, people could say, so what? Well, here's the so what. For all those years, Turkey was a strategic partner of the State of Israel. Less so today, as we know, a lot less so. But for many years, a close strategic partner, which helps explain, by the way, and Peter, correct me if I'm wrong, why no Israeli prime minister has ever used the G word. Correct? From Ben-Gurion to Netanyahu. No Israeli prime minister. Now remember, the first genocide of the 20th century, the one that may have ushered in some respects, or paved the way for our genocide, and yet no Israeli prime minister would dare raise the issue. And the Turkish Jewish community put in a very difficult position, coming frequently to AJC and other organizations, Bruce, to say, don't recognize the genocide. Don't recognize the genocide. We'll pay a price for it. Why Azerbaijan? Because Azerbaijan is an implacable foe of Armenia because of disputed land, is close culturally, linguistically to Turkey. And for us, Azerbaijan is important. Why? Because it is a Shia Muslim majority country that borders Iran, that is a close strategic partner of the State of Israel, that has a long-standing Jewish community that has experienced virtually no anti-Semitism over the centuries, and that is a friend of the United States. So you begin with a simple conversation on campus, say UCLA, because there's a big Armenian community, Bruce, out in Southern California. So, okay, I'm a Jewish student on campus. There's an Armenian student. The Armenian student says, hey, can you support our genocide resolution, and we'll support you on the Holocaust. Terrific. And then all of a sudden, gee, I didn't realize. You mean there are more layers of this? You mean the Turks are now going to hate me?
You mean I may complicate issues because even this is going to be a news story in Turkey? Jewish students at UCLA support Armenians. Then the Jewish community of Turkey calls to AJC and says, tell the students at UCLA to stop because now we're feeling the heat. So my point is, Bruce, coalition building and friend raising are at the core of what we do at AJC. We shouldn't do it alone. We don't have to do it alone. There are 250 million people out there and more who are our friends or potential friends. But every once in a while, there's a bump in the road and you have to navigate it. Thank you all so very much.
We want to thank David for all that he does. I have to tell you, on this particular day, on the anniversary of what happened in Pittsburgh, there's nothing, I believe, more important than we could do. Because what David is talking about is part of our tradition in the sense of Nachshon ben Amidav, who stood on the edge of the water, and it wasn't until he walked into the water, took action, that the waters began to part. It is not until we stand up for ourselves and take action that there will be change in all that comes. David, for all that you do, for all that AJC does, for those who support that, we thank you so much and thank you for being here. Thank you for your patience and being here.